big blue beam of light spotted coming out of the base. This time, people see a weird cloud appear above the base. And several triangle-shaped UFOs and a cigar-shaped UFO appear. And then either leave or disappear. They're just gone, again, after a period of time. And then the cloud sits there for a while and then disappears. So it's interesting because obviously, those things make you think of, they made me think of Project Bluebeam, where it's not necessarily that there were UFOs floating over this base, but the blue beam was a holographic projector, making the UFOs appear to be there. Some people have said that the UFO seemed to go where the beam moved, like the beam was shifting around the base. So they were saying the beam was controlling the UFO, but again, it could have been that the blue beam was actually the holographic projector putting this up in the sky. Now, I poo-pooed all over Project Bluebeam in the episode that I covered that. And these stories of the blue beam and the UFO are all around the same time that the Project Bluebeam theory was getting started. But again, Project Bluebeam was fairly obscure back then. Like, back then, a lot of you guys, a lot of you younger kids have to realize that back then, to be involved in conspiracy theories, you had to track down books and magazines. And you're like, yeah, of course, Jason, but it was different. Like, you only had access to the conspiracy information that you stumbled across. There was no real cross-referencing unless you were Giles from Buffy. Like, you read a magazine or a book, and that was pretty much all the information you had unless you could find another book on that subject. There was no Amazon, your libraries didn't cover this stuff. So the fact that these people are telling stories about these blue beams and these UFOs appearing, it's possible that this was where the guy who created Bluebeam came up with his idea. It's possible that Bluebeam has an element of truth in it. The weird cloud would be what you would project the image on. But I mean, again, that's so funny because that episode I completely dismissed Project Bluebeam as the rantings of a lunatic, and then I find this stuff. And what I always find interesting is that when I'm reading about this stuff, they never once reference Project Bluebeam, and when I was researching Project Bluebeam, they never once referenced the Pine Gap group, which makes me think that one or both are true. If these guys, if on these sites they're like, because again, conspiracy theorists were working in the dark back then. So nowadays it's easy to go, oh, did you know Miley Cyrus is an Illuminati agent? Look at all these websites that agree with me. Look at all this stuff that agrees with me. As opposed to, I have this theory that I'm going to come up with in Australia of these events these people saw. And then in Canada, you have someone else come up with the theory around the same time, and they're both parallel to each other, and they never reference each other. It lends a little more credibility to it. But then we get to Richard Saunders. Richard Saunders and a couple other researchers have really tried digging into the Pine Gap group. And then it's almost like disinfo at this point. So you go, UFOs are being seen around this isolated facility. We know the CIA runs it. We know that it's used to spy on people and intercept radio waves and stuff like that. And then someone else shows up and goes, well, actually, you want to know what's really going on at Pine Gap? Apparently, there's a 5.3 mile deep borehole right underneath Pine Gap facility that holds a death ray to shoot aliens. That's a really good way to fight aliens. They're like, oh, you bastards, bring your ships right over Australia and we'll show you. What? Doesn't really make sense if you can't rotate the planet at will. It's not the Death Star. But anyways, there's a death ray down there. It also can shoot up, apparently, this is actually a different conspiracy theory, but the borehole can shoot up VF frequencies all around the planet that actually extend 250 miles outside the atmosphere of the planet. For what reason, they don't really say. They just say it's capable of doing that. Even the people who invented it, they're like, why did we invent this? And they're like, because we can. They're like, it's not doing anything. We don't even know if it works. We just want to do it. Some people believe that in this 5.3 mile hole, which probably doesn't even exist, but there's a lot of conspiracy theories about this. I don't really think it's safe to build a base over a giant gaping hole in your planet. Some people believe in this hole it's where the elites are going to hide out at the end of the world. Some people believe it holds a supercomputer that's so powerful that Bill Clinton once went there. You can tell how old these conspiracy theories are. Bill Clinton once went there, and he can go up to the computer and go, can you tell me about Jason Carpenter? And it's like, Jason Carpenter, podcast host, lives in Hood River, eats coconut oil. You don't want to know what he does 5 times a day? He walks a lot. Like, this computer's so advanced, based on all the spy information and its own advanced AI, it knows everything about everybody. You can ask it, hey, so what does Britney Spears' kisses taste like? And it's like, tastes like vanilla and sapphire. I didn't know sapphire had a taste. Yes, kiss Britney Spears, you'll find out. Beep, bop, boop. But anyways, like, it knows everything about everybody. Apparently, this is a very crowded hole, if you haven't already figured it out. Death Ray, Antenna Gun, a bunch of elites living down there, and now it has a supercomputer. It also houses our time soldiers. So apparently, and again, I think this is the best way to wrap this up. There also has a Stargate to go to Mars. You can go to Pine Gap and then walk through a doorway and end up on Mars and then suffocate. Oh, I shouldn't have done this. But apparently you can do that. You can walk into Mars. Soldiers are trained to fight the wars of today. You won't have laser guns in the past. It's the year 2018. It's like, oh yeah. Then, after all of their training, they are sent back to Australia. Here's your orders. They're like, what's this? They're like, oh, we need you to go sit in this base in Dusseldorf, Germany. He's like, okay. He just sits there. He's an MP. Why would you train soldiers in the future and send them back here where there's basically like no major conflicts? It seems like a total waste of resources. Total waste of resources to send these trained future tech Captain Power soldiers to Australia, and then just have them like guarding posts in South Korea. Total waste. But I guess if you have a time machine, I mean, you're gonna have to use it. You have to prove that your budget is worth something. So that is the story of Pine Gap. Maybe Sherry Shriner wasn't as much as a nut job as I put her out to be. She obviously knew about these guys and I didn't. Thanks, Alex F, for the recommendation. And just a little tip here, Although Merrick did go to Finn McCool's cave and take a photo of it and visit it because of the podcast, don't visit this place. Don't be like, hey, don't get arrested by these time soldiers. You're standing in front of a portal and you're like, oh no, Dead Rabbit told me about your show. He knows everything about you guys. And they're like, oh, we already talked to the supercomputer. We know everything about Jason Carpenter. And then they push you into Mars. So yeah, don't go there. Don't go there. As curious as you are. Okay, but let's go ahead and move on to our next story here. Now, our next story is part of our Too Good to Be True week, where we're going to talk about stories that you did not know were based on true stories, but actually were. And this one I actually knew about, because I watched the commentary I love director's commentary for movies, or writer commentary or whatever. I love behind the scenes stuff. It's one of my favorite things. And I was watching the director's commentary for Nightmare on Elm Street, and it had the actress who played Nancy on there. It had Wes Craven, the director, and I believe he wrote it as well. And then I think they had a producer and someone else. In the commentary for Nightmare on Elm Street, Wes Craven says, this is based on a true story. And someone else goes, what? And they're like, yeah, this Nightmare on Elm Street is based on a true story. And he weaves this tale about what happened. Now, what I'm about to tell you is referenced a little bit in the show notes, but in the show notes it mostly just refers to an interview he did for like Cinema Blend. When you watch the commentary, which is again the first time I heard about it, this is the version I heard. Back in the 80s when he was living in LA, there was a series of articles about these young Southeast Asian men dying in their sleep. What would happen is that they would start having horrible nightmares, and then they would tell their loved ones, I'm having the worst nightmares. I keep having these awful nightmares. And eventually they'd go to sleep and they'd die in their sleep. And it was just these little as one after another, like a couple of them had passed away, but after there was a pattern, you'd see a little blurb in the newspaper. Wes Craven would be like, I was reading the LA Times and I'd see this little blurb and I go, that's kind of creepy. And then eventually the LA Times ran a longer story in 1981 about one boy in particular. And again, he was from Southeast Asia. And he began having these nightmares. And he says, if I fall asleep, I'm going to die. And his parents were really concerned, and they take him to the doctor, and they're trying to get him to sleep, and they're trying to put sleeping pills in his stuff, and he's like refusing it. He's refusing treatment. He's drinking a bunch of coffee. He refuses to go to sleep. He's like setting alarm clocks to go off at random times so he can't accidentally doze off. He stays awake for 4 days. And then finally, in the end, he falls asleep. I think it was on the couch, and the parents are like, oh, finally, it's over. And they take him to the bedroom, and then they hear him yelling, and they go in there, and he's dead. The end. And Wes Craven was like, oh, that is an awesome horror movie. So he creates the character of Freddy Krueger. And it's funny because you're watching the commentary of this movie, of this dude just butchering people, And you just in the middle of it, he's like, yeah. And he goes, the entire third act of the movie is based on that last article. Like, Nancy gets taken to the hospital. It's funny because now I realize, I'm assuming all of you guys know what the concept of Nightmare on Elm Street is. This monster, he probably has one of the best origin stories of any serial killer. His mom is raped by 100 maniacs in an insane asylum, and this kid is born. And then he gets a job at an elementary school, and he begins molesting and murdering these kids just one after another. He gets arrested for it. He gets off on trial, like on a technicality. He doesn't get convicted. He goes back to his shack that's outside of the school, and then the townspeople get together, form a vigilante mob, and burn him to death. And then he gets his revenge by now killing everyone else's kids. All the people who killed him, he's killing their kids. It's basically Clint Eastwood as a bad guy. Like, that's a really great origin story for a villain. I can't really think of another horror movie icon who has such a great origin story. I think it's just really, really well done. It's super creepy. He's basically feels he's been wronged. He's like, no, you should have let me keep... It would be one thing if he was convicted and he wasn't guilty, but no, he's like, oh no, I love murdering kids. Like, I'm totally down with that. In the new remake, they actually explicitly said he was molesting them as well. In the original versions, it was just kind of implied. But yeah, he's basically like, he's not a wrongfully convicted spirit. He's a serial killer who wasn't done killing people, and now he's killing people's kids to get back at him. Very, very interesting origin story for a killer. But that's the concept. Is the story true, though? Wes Craven said he read these news articles. Do the news articles exist? Yes, you can still read them today. You'll see them in the show notes. Articles from 1981, 1988, documenting this stuff in the LA Times. The question is it a real syndrome? Does it really happen? Or are the articles just taking urban legends and crafting them into an article? Not only does it happen, it happens so regularly, it's been named by the medical community. This is absolutely bizarre. Originally, the designation of it was Oriental Nightmare Death Syndrome, because it almost exclusively targets Southeast Asian men. They all tend to be young. Their average age is 33, so that also fits with the idea of younger people being killed by this thing. But 18 to your 30s, 40s, around there. The medical community has no idea what causes this. It's now been termed Sudden Unexpected Nocturnal Death Syndrome. So it's basically the adult version of a crib death or sudden infant death syndrome. But it targets a particular theory, which you had all these young men who died in LA who were part of the story had just left Laos. They had just left Cambodia. They just left the Vietnam War. You know, the Americans pulled out, and it was still just a total quagmire, garbage heap over there, with all these regional warlords trying to consolidate power. There's death camps. You had Pol Pot. You had just these massive genocides, and people were leaving the country. So they figured that there must be a connection. These kids must have gone through so much stress in their young life that they're having heart attacks. And that's the thing. They're not even having heart attacks. They think that what could be happening is that their heart rhythm goes out while they're sleeping, which is technically a heart attack, but it's not ruled a heart attack. You just go to bed and die. It's not rare either. 43, like in America, it's set up like this. 43 per 100,000 people in these communities. Hmong, Cambodian, I think there's some from Vietnam. 43 out of 100,000 people. I had to do some context for that. I was like, that number, I don't know if that's high or low. That's 4 times the amount of automobile deaths in the United States per 100,000. 6 times the murder rate, and 20 times the amount of people who die of AIDS. 43 per 100,000 is incredibly high. It was like in the top 4 causes of death in these groups is bad. And what's weird is that none of the articles I read said it peaked during the period right after the Vietnam War, but none of them said it's gone now. No one's saying that it's gone now. And that's in general for people from Southeast Asia. Among the Hmong population, which we had a big Hmong population in Sacramento, 82 deaths per 100,000 people. And among just people in Laos in general, 92 per 100,000. So all of that would be 60 times the rate of people who die of AIDS. It's affecting this community. This medical community doesn't know what's causing this. But the people who are suffering from it know 100% what the problem is. 100%.